All right, Rabbi, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, for dedicating all the Shir Midrashos this year as a zechus for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tammuz, Habalim Latova, Aaron and Alana Weinberg, and thanks to Hashem for all of his nisim, both the revealed and the hidden. For the miracle of Yonatan Shai Weinberg 14 years ago, for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael, for Eretz Yisrael, and the merit of the speedy arrival of Moshiach. But Daniel and Batsheva Pava of Eretz Yisrael, in commemoration of the second yahrzeit of Batsheva's father, Rabbi Shlomo ben Yehuda Aryeh Vey of Philadelphia, which is on the 7th of Tammuz. He was a child survivor of Auschwitz and left over 100 descendants. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Salav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all of those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Yisrael, Kadosh Baruch Hu, Shem Hashem, bring home our hostages. The Shalom and the Karov should allow our holy soldiers to be successful. B'chol ma'aseh yedehem at Emeretz Hashem halavai. Klal Yisrael should be benched. B'soros tovos, Yeshuas and Nechamas, and Geula b'mehera b'yameinu. Amen. Well, so with that, let us be. We have a lot to do today. A really incredible daf ahead of us. Today's daf is Yud Dalid 14, and we are picking up Emeretz Hashem on Yud Gimel Amud Beis 13b. We left off at the two dots before the Mishnah. So it is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, about 20 lines up from the bottom. Rabbi Yaakov Zaban Sandalas. Moses, remember again, in yesterday's Mishnah, we were talking about the concept, once again, the continued discussion about halacha l'maaseh patronizing stores that may be paying taxes to the Avoda Zara. And especially again, on the day of the actual celebration itself, being concerned that if one goes in and patronizes one of these establishments, so one could be inadvertently going ahead and supporting Avoda Zara. So along these same themes, the Gemara tells a story. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yaakov Zaban Sandala. Rabbi Yaakov went ahead and bought a pair of sandals from one of these stores. Rabbi Yirmiyah Zaban Pita. Rabbi Yirmiyah bought bread. So they encountered each other after having made their respective purchases. So a very interesting exchange. So one said to his fellow, Yasma, you orphan, Avad Rab Chahachi, would your Rebbe have acted like this? Now both say, now when they called each other orphan, that was a shtach, right? What do I mean by that? So obviously, just like an orphan doesn't have a parent, they were accusing each other of being like orphaned of a Rebbe, right? You orphan, you don't have a Rebbe? You don't have, what are you, an orphan? Would your Rebbe have done this? Amar le'idach, the other one, right? So one said that to the other. Then the other one responded, Yasma, you're the Yasam. Avid Rab Chahachi, right? Don't call me a Yasam, you're a Yasam, right? Would your Rebbe have acted this way? Suppose obviously what they were both doing was they were giving each other a shtach for having patronized the store owned by an akum. So the Gemara says, 1 second, hold up. What happened over here? V'tarvayu mi balabayis zavin. Now the truth is, both of them, both the purchases were totally legal. Why? They actually did not buy it from shopkeepers. Rather, who did they buy it from? A balabas, right? Now again, we saw this beforehand, a private individual. So we saw this already back in the Mishnah, that this whole issue of patronizing the store of an akum and having the akum pay taxes to whatever the local Avoda Zara establishment, that was only a din in what we'll call established proprietors, store owners. But again, a balabayis who just goes ahead and sells stuff from his home, Bipashtos was not paying a tax, and therefore halacha l'maaseh was permitted. So in fact, interestingly enough, they both had engaged in permitted activity, but they both assumed that the other had bought from a merchant, which I will say is such a fascinating idea. You know, if you think about this, they said pretty heated words, right? To call someone a yasam, right? Because essentially that's like saying, like, obviously you have no Rebbe. Obviously, you have no one. It's a pretty strong statement, and incredibly enough, they came to that realization just based on what they saw. And again, they both were wrong. Tremendous Moshe Haskell. How often does this happen to us in life? We see a situation, we see a circumstance, we see a person doing something. We automatically create an entire narrative around their behavior, only to find out I was wrong. I was wrong. So the Gemara goes right to the Gemara says, the Amar Rabbi Abba Braid Reb Chia Bar Abba Loshon ela b'lokech min hatagar. This shakli michsa minei. This whole prohibition of patronizing the store of an akum is dafka only by a formal proprietor, by a store. Why? Because when you purchase from a store, the shopkeeper is going to go ahead and pay the taxes. Ava b'lokech mi balabayis. Delo shakli minei michsa. When you purchase from a householder, just stamagaya, stamabalabas, where he's not paying taxes on anything, ultimately mutter. Amar Rabbi Rabbi Bar Abba. Ilmale Hayar Rabbi Yochanan Ha Zimna. It's interesting enough, the Gemara says now, the Gemara ends off with the following. Rabbi Abba Brei Rabbi Chia, Rabbi said as follows. If Rabbi Yochanan were alive now, right, Ilmale Hayar Rabbi Yochanan Ha Zimna, if Rabbi Yochanan was living in this time, so Ba'asra de Kashakli Michsa Filimi Balabayis Hava Aser. So this is interesting. So as Rabbi Abba seems to be highlighting is, practices seem to have evolved and changed, and there were places that did collect taxes even from balabatim, right? That even if you were stam, like an individual guy just selling stuff out of your house, they would have also collected taxes. So Rabbi Abba says, Rabbi Yochanan been alive now, and seen that they collect taxes even from a balabayis, hava aser. Ultimately, again, he would have asered this practice as well. In other words, which makes sense, because once they're collecting taxes from balabatim, then by definition you can't buy from the balabas either, because you're also inadvertently supporting Avoda Zara. Ela inhu heichi zabin. But 1 second, here's the problem. Now the Gemara is making the assumption over there that Rabbi Abba is referring to the times in which Rabbi Yaakov and Rabbi Yirmiyah are living as well. In which case we said before that Rabbi Yaakov was able to buy the sandals, Rabbi Yirmiyah was able to buy the bread because they bought it from a balabayis. But now Rabbi Abba makes it sound that even the balabayis is paying taxes. So what's happening over here? How are they permitted to go ahead? How are they permitted to make their respective purchases if they're going to be paying taxes, if the balabais is paying taxes? So it's very interesting, which the Gemara says, Ela inhu heichi zabin. So how are Rabbi Abba and how were Rabbi Abba and how are Rabbi Yaakov and Rabbi Yirmiyah able to buy the sandals and the bread if the balabais is also paying taxes? To which the Gemara says, Mi balabayis she'eno kavua zabun. They bought it from a balabayis who doesn't regularly sell items. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, she'ena kavua. Rashi says, v'lo masek muksi adatayu lemigbi minayu, delo tagar v'la balabayis kavua. So apparently, even though already in the times of Rabbi Abba, everybody was paying taxes. Merchants were paying taxes. A balabayis who regularly sold from his home was paying taxes. But that was only if you were what we call someone who sold stuff on a regular basis. But if halacha l'maisa, again, you kind of were like, I don't know, an episodic seller, just a recreational seller. You're cleaning out your garage, so you put stuff for a garage sale. But you're not an established merchant. They would not tax you. So that apparently, again, when Rabbi Yaakov and Rabbi Yirmiyah bought their sandals and their bread, they were buying it from one of these kind of balabatim. Okay, so it turns out at the end of the sugya that there's essentially 3 categories of sellers. There's the classic tagar, who is the merchant, who the Mishnah tells us again, on any day where there's a Yom Tiv, you can't purchase from that person. Rabbi said, I just want to point out how this is a little bit different. So remember again, beforehand we were talking about just engaging in transactions with an akum. This is now in a more commercial setting. So the Mishnah tells me I can't do that on the day of the Yom Tiv. Why? Because they're going to pay taxes to the Avoda Zara. That's category 1. Category 2 is a balabayis who is also an established merchant. What's the chilik between the tagar and the balabayis? The balabayis is selling, I don't know, from his house. But this is what he does. He's an established vendor. He's also apparently going to be paying taxes. Therefore, again, you can't patronize him either. That's on the Yom Tov. The third category is just a stam balabais who's not kavua. This is an individual who's going to go ahead and sell stuff, but not really in an established fashion. Such a person, again, doesn't pay taxes at all, and therefore, again, halacha l'maaseh, you could patronize such an individual. Okay, fascinating. So we're both continuing on the same theme over here. So Mishnah, the following things, so now a little bit of switching gears, the following things you cannot sell to an akum. Now again, we're going to see why you can't sell them is because these were things that were often used in the service of Avoda Zara. So you can't sell the following things. What can't you sell them? It's tarublin. Okay, we'll define what that is in the Gemara. Benos shuach, we'll define what that is in the Gemara. Pitu taros. Now, pitu taros literally means stems. Again, we'll define what that means in the Gemara as well. Ulevona, frankincense, Tarnagol halavan, a white rooster. Rabbi Yehuda says, Mutter limkar lo Tarnagol lavan bena Tarnagolim. Rabbi Yehuda says, if you're selling an akum, a bunch of roosters, and in that chevra, in the rooster chevra, there's also a white rooster, that's going to be permitted. That'll be fine. What happens if you want to sell a single white rooster to the akum? So the Gemara says, Kotea es etzba'o umochro. You could cut off one of its fingers. One of its, I don't know, is it a finger or a toe by a rooster? Claw. Okay, right. Good. You cut off one of the claws and ultimately sell. Now, what's the chap with that? Because interestingly enough, apparently even by the akum, if the animal is deficient, if it's chaser, they don't offer it. So apparently we're going to see there's something with white roosters. So if you're going to sell a white rooster, ultimately again to the akum, then cut off one of the claws and ultimately sell it. Ultimately again, because they do not go ahead and wash. They do not go ahead and offer up chaser, a deficient item, to their Avoda Zara. So it's a very, very interesting idea over here, which also tremendous Musar Haskell, if you think about it as well, that even of the Avoda Zara, if you're going to do it, make sure you do it in a shalim fashion. Don't do it chaser. So many times we will say in life, we start things, we do things, and then we just kind of like, we don't give it our all. So halacha l'maaseh, again, if you're going to do something in life, make sure that it's shalim. You're going to engage in spiritual service, make sure there's a sense of shleimus. Even the Avoda Zara understand, don't offer up something that is chaser. Incredible. Ushar kol advarim, and again, all other items, staman mutter, uperushan aser. So we'll see exactly what this means. All the other items, it sounds like what it's saying is if you just sell it stam to an akum, ultimately again it's going to be mutter. But perushan, if you go ahead and it's explicit, and again we'll have to define what this means. Aser. Reimer says, Reimer Omer af dekel tav the chatzav aser limkola of dekel chavim. Reimer says you also can't sell a dekel tav. And we'll say dekel tav literally sounds like a good palm tree. A good palm tree. You can't sell a good palm tree and a chatzav. We'll see what that means. Good. Here we go. Top of Yudalid. Let's go. Says the Gemara. My itztarublin. What's an itztarublin? Tarnisa. It's a tarnisa. Very helpful for us. Rashi says over here, right? What's tarnisa? Top Rashi. Min eresu vihi shita kidam Rosh Hashanah. So it's a type of cedar tree. Thank you. A type of cedar tree. Okay. So Gemara says Raminhu. Gemara is a kasha. Is that true? Is that a true definition? Hosifu alei. And I will say now this brayse that the Gemara is quoting over here happens to be by Shemitah. Rashi says le'inyan shvius. So now it says by Shemitah hosifu aleihen alachsin v'itztarublin muchsasin ubenos shuach. So these are items ultimately again that are included in the Shemitah prohibition. So the Gemara says v'isa dait itztarublin tarnisa me'isa b'shiyas. Now if you think that the itztarublin is in fact this tarnisa, which is a type of cedar, is this item really included in the Shemitah prohibition? Now this is very interesting. Why isn't the cedar tree included in the Shemitah prohibition? This is fascinating. He says, Disnan, zeh klal. Kol sheyesh lo ikar, yesh lo shvius, v'chol she'ein lo ikar, ein lo shvius. So this is actually a fascinating halacha. Ikar means a root. So the Gemara says, whatever has a root ultimately is subject to the laws of Shemitah, and whatever doesn't have a root is not subject to the laws of Shemitah. Now, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, second line from the top, Kol she'ein lo ikar, liskayim ba'aretz b'yemos hagishamim, kigon kishun deluin. So Rabbi say, listen to this. Any object, any item, planted item, that has a root that is able to live through the winter, ultimately is subject to Shemitah. But any item that does not, that has a root source that dries up or that withers away during the winter, is not subject to Shemitah. It's fascinating halacha. So therefore, again, apparently, this itztarublin. So if the itztarublin, see, here's our problem, right? Let's just go trace this. Mishnah says you can't sell the itztarublin to the akum. Gemara, what's itztarublin? Gemara's answer: Tornisa, a type of cedar tree. Gemara says that can't be true. Why? Because again, in the Mishnah over here in Shvius, or I should say it's actually a Mishnah in Shabbos, in the Mishnah in Shabbos, it says the following items are subject to Shemitah. Included in that list is itztarublin. only items subject to the laws of Shemitah are items that have root systems which endure during the winter. And again, the Tarnisa, the cedar tree, does not have that type of root system. Therefore, again, Istarublin can't be Tarnisa. That's the point the Gemara is making over here. Ella, I'll just also point out the wording over here is very beautiful. Koshi yeshlo ikar, yeshlo shvius. We'll say that one of the most beautiful things we have in our Yiddishkeit is Shabbos. Shabbos. So the shaila is what makes Shabbos so special? What is it about Shabbos that's so incredible? So the real power of Shabbos is the day in which you really reap the collective benefits of how you've spent your week. Right? A powerful Shabbos is one that follows on the heels of a powerful week. Sheshes yomim tasem melachtecha. If for 6 days I'm plugging away, for 6 days I'm working hard, not just at my job, but in my ruchnius, right? Literally, again, I'm learning, I'm davening, I'm doing chesed, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to be doing, then Shabbos ultimately becomes so powerful. Shabbos is the composite of 6 days of dynamic activity. So it's really the lashon over here also, kol sheyesh lo ikar, whoever has a purpose in his life, whoever has an ikar in the way that he lives, Sunday through Friday, yesh lo shvius. The 7th day Shabbos will be incredibly special. Sirbo said, otherwise, and you see this, Shabbos could be a day in which I crash from just working very hard during the week, in which case you emerge from Shabbos physically rested, but not necessarily spiritually restored. Or Shabbos could be a day where ultimately the collective benefit of how I toil during the 6 days, kol sheyesh lo ikar, whoever ultimately, again, has purposeful, intentional, driven life, Sunday through Friday, yesh lo shvius. That person Shabbos will be, that's mamish me'ein olam haba. So again, but what's it's the rublin? El amar of safra, piri de arza. Oh, so it's the rublin is not the cedar tree itself, rather what is it's the rublin? Ultimately, again, it is the fruit of the cedar tree. The fruit of the cedar tree. Piri de arza. V'chein ki asa rabin amar belazar, piri de arza. Ultimately, again, the fruit of the cedar tree. Incredible. Okay, so therefore, we've got our first definition down. So apparently, and again, the common denominator amongst all these items is going to be that these were actively used in Avoda Zara. So you can't go ahead and sell the Avoda Zara, it's the rublin. Okay, next, Benos Shuach, Amra Barachana, Amra Yochanan, Te'eni Chirasa, white dates. White dates, once again, I will say, nothing special per se about these items except that just they were actually used for Avodah Zara purposes. Okay, next, Pitu Taros. What are Pitu Taros? Amra Yochanan, Bepit Trusehen Shanu. So we'll say, so again, now remember, Pitu Taros are stems. So when you read the Mishnah, what it sounds like over here is that Pitutaros is a separate category, right? Because the Mishnah reads, these are the things you can't sell to an Ovid Kochavim. You can't sell, it's the rublin, which now we've established as the fruit of the cedar tree. Right? Next, what can't you do? Beno Shuach, white dates. And then it says Pitutaros, stems. Almost sounds like stems is a third category. Now, also, interesting enough, the Gemara says, no. Stems is actually a modifier on the previous two. What it means is the dates and the fruits of the cedar tree, ultimately, again, those can't be sold with their stem. So Rashi points out over here, look at Rashi, Piturosehen Shanu, first short line in Rashi, Pitutaros demasnisin lav minhu ba'ape nafshe. Pitutaros, right, the stems is not its own category, elahachi kamar, a mochrin lahem kol elu, it's the rublin, ubenos shuach be'uktseyen, lefisha tolin osan b'fnei avodas kochavim, v'darkan la'avdan b'kach. This is very interesting. What would they do with the white dates? And what would they do with the white figs, I should say? And the fruits from the cedar tree, they would dangle it. So what they would do is they would keep it on the stem. They would tie the stem and apparently, hang it on the idol, hang it next to the idol. So the stems were necessary parts ultimately of the fruit. Okay, incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. Levona, frankincense. Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Shimon Lakish. Levona Zaka. It was not just any frankincense, not just any Levona, but pure Levona. Okay, so when it says Tana, umikulan mochlan lahen chavila. So it says, so this is very interesting. So now, I can't sell Levona to an akum. And again, I will say, interestingly enough, I just want to point out, up until now, Everything we've been dealing with has been very what we'll call either, date-centric or date-specific, right? In other words, I can't transact business with an akum on a particular day or a certain number of days leading up to a particular day. If you notice over here, the conversation has switched, and now it has nothing to do with date and everything to do with product. The following items are items that are regularly used in the worship of Avoda Zara. Therefore, it doesn't matter when, you cannot sell these to an akum. Now, the Gemara gives an interesting exception to this. Reish Lakish says, what you can do is you can sell to them in bulk, essentially. So I could sell, let's say, Lavona to an akum in bulk. Now, what's the logic behind that? Because since I'm selling it in bulk, the assumption is he's going to resell it to others. That's the assumption. In other words, if somebody is buying something for their Avoda Zara, they're going to buy a small amount. You're buying a large amount, but pashtos, you're going to resell. So the Gemara says, "V'kama chavila," how much is considered to be a large amount? Perish Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira, ein chavila pechusa mishalosh manin. Three min. Right, 3 mana, I should say. 3 mana. But 1 second. So let's say again, so now the Mishnah says is like this. To sell, let's say, I don't know, whatever, we'll call it a small amount. To sell a ladle full of Lavona to an akum, I'm not allowed to do, because ultimately, again, he's going to use it for Avoda Zara, but I can sell him a large amount of Lavona, because I know that's for resale. That's for resale. He's not going to use it for Avoda Zara, he's going to resell it. Besides the Gemara, maybe I should be concerned that he in turn is going to sell it to someone else who's going to use it for Avoda Zara. So aren't I still participatory in Avoda Zara, in the performance of Avoda Zara in some way? It's very interesting. Amar Abaye, alifnei mefakdinan, alifnei delifnei lo mefakdinan. So Rabbi says it's very interesting. I am charged ultimately again with, or I am prohibited from lifnei iver lo sitei mechshal. Right? This goes back to the beginning of the Masechta. Why can't I sell item? Why can't I transact business with an Oved Kochavim up on his Yom Tov or leading up to his on some of these items? Because again, I am creating a stumbling block for him. I am one of the reasons at least, is that I am facilitating the performance of his Avoda Zara. So the Gemara says, when is this prohibition? With direct participation, right? Or direct participation, but what we call lifnei delifnei, where essentially I'm 2 steps removed. So what? We're afraid now I'm going to sell it in bulk to the akum, which is permitted because he's doing it for resale, and he's going to resell it to someone else, and that's my problem. That's not my problem. That's not my problem. Alifnei mefakdinan, alifnei delifnei lo mefakdinan. They will say also that lashon over here is so profound as well. Now, obviously, the lifnei they're talking about over here is lifnei iver lo sitei michshal. Do not place a stumbling block in front of someone. So me selling the lavona, let's say to an akum, that's lifnei iver. Me selling in bulk to the akum and him reselling it to someone else, that's what's called lifnei delifnei. It's 2 steps removed. And remember, this whole thing is rabbinic to begin with. We're not going to start legislating additional layers of rabbinic prohibition. They will say, but there is a certain, the lashon itself is so beautiful. In life, when we entertain the possibility of taking on something new, or we entertain the possibility of taking ourselves in a different direction, or just embarking on a new adventure, taking on additional responsibilities. So often what we end up doing is we try to figure out, or we try to contemplate all of the different things that could happen. And I want to pivot in my life. Well, if I do this, so this could go wrong, this could go wrong. And obviously, one can't live life blindly. But sometimes what ends up happening is that we overthink things to a point that it renders us absolutely passive. So I think what the Gemara is also telling us is, alifnei mefakdinan. When you make decisions in life, definitely contemplate what's in front of you. But alifnei delifnei lo mefakdinan. If in life you begin to contemplate every single what if, so first of all, there's no end to the what ifs in life. And if you contemplate every single one what if, that'll lead you to only one inescapable conclusion, which is inaction, passivity, and non-performance. Life is this fascinating balance between, on one hand, thinking about the possibilities and the dangers and the what ifs in front of you, the alifnei, but alifnei delifnei, thinking things out too much, unfortunately just lends to a systemic life of passivity. Incredible, or a life of systemic passivity. Tarnagol Lavan, next. Don't sell white roosters to an akum. Says the Gemara, Amr Rabbi Yonah, Amr Rabbi Zera, Amr Rabbi Zvid. Viki Damasnili, Amr Rabbi Yonah, Amr Rabbi Zera. Tarnagolami. Supposed to listen to this. What happens if an akum comes along, right? And an akum is shopping for a tarnagol. He doesn't, obviously, if the akum shows up and he says, listen, I need a white rooster, trouble, right? Run, right? Pretend like you didn't hear him, right? We'll go, don't sell it because that's for Avoda Zara. But let's say he shows up and he says, tarnagolami. In other words, who has a rooster I can purchase? Now, what's unique about this case? He's not going ahead and asking for a white rooster. He's just saying, who has a rooster? Mutar limkar lo tanagol lavan. In this case, again, the Gemara says, you could sell him a white rooster. Why? Because since he's not asking for a white rooster, the assumption is he's not in the market for a white rooster. Therefore, you can sell him a white rooster. He's not going to use it for Avoda Zara. Rabbi Huda says as follows. Mocher hulo tarnagol lavan bena tarnagolim. So Rabbi Huda says, remember again, what did our Mishnah say? Rabbi Huda said that you can sell an akum, a white rooster, if you're selling him a chevra of roosters, right? A group. So I'm selling him a group of roosters, and inside of the group is a white rooster, that is permitted to sell to him. So the Gemara says, Hey Chidami, what's the case? Ilema dekamar tarnagol lavan lami. Tarnagol lavan lami. So if the akum is saying, listen, who has a white rooster, right? This is what he's saying. Who has a white rooster? Who has a white rooster? He's asking for that. Then ultimately, again, afilu bein hatarnagolim namilo. Then again, I will say, if he's actively asking for a white rooster, then halacha l'maisa, even if I'm selling him a group of roosters, I still should not be able to sell him a white rooster. Elalav de ka'amar tarnagolami, tarnagolami. Rather, it must be, what's the case? The case is where he's just shopping for a rooster, right? Who has a rooster? Who has a rooster? And even in that case, where he's not even mentioning a white rooster, Tafilu hachi, the Rabbi Huda bena tarnagolim in bifnei atzmo lo. So we'll say, what do you see from here? That according to Rabbi Huda, even if he's just asking for a non-specific rooster, the only permit you have to sell him a white rooster is when you're selling it to him in a group. In a group of roosters. Well, the Tanakama, so does that say that according to the Tanakama, you can't sell him a white rooster under any circumstances, even as part of a rooster chavra? What's the case? Kigon the Amar zeh v'zeh. What's the case here? I will say, very interesting, where ultimately, again, the Akum says, I'll take this rooster and that rooster. Look at Rashi. Hachama haskinon the Amar zeh v'zeh. Masnisin v'lo Rabbi Yehuda b'fnei atzmo v'lo Tanakama lagamre asklon demeikara adkar lavan b'shachar v'adam hilchach. So it says very interesting. So let's say the Akum says, I'll take a white rooster, a black rooster, and a red rooster, right? So what happens? He wants all kinds of roosters. So Rabbi Yehuda b'fnei atzmo also gave him the meikar adkar v'hashta shakal lavan v'azlei meikar nami chavin lavan v'hayda adkar shachar irume aran. So Rabbi Yehuda will say in that case over here, since he identified, any time that you actively identify a white rooster, even if halach l'maisa you're buying it in the context of a group, the purchase is going to be prohibited. The only time, ultimately, again, a white rooster is permitted is when color was not identified, and he's just buying a chevra of roosters, a group. Then ultimately, again, a white one will be permitted. Incredible. So the Gemara that supports this. Rabbi Yehuda, a Masai. When is it mutar? Bizman sha'amar tarnagol zeh. Sorry, when is it aser? Right? Bizman sha'amar tarnagol zeh lavan. Avalim amar zeh v'zeh mutar. So we'll say, so now the Gemara says Rabbi Yehuda will hold like this. Rabbi Yehuda will say that halacha l'maisa, the only time that a white rooster is going to be problematic is when the akol mamish identifies it. He identifies, I want that rooster, right? Tarnagol zeh. But if he says zeh v'zeh, but again, if he goes ahead and he identifies a group, now again, in this version, Rabbi Yehuda, even if halacha l'maisa, so in Rabbi Yehuda's model, he's going ahead and, what happened here? Sorry. Seem to have frozen. It's not even a good pose that it's frozen on. It just looks weird. All right. Okay, we'll have to figure it out afterwards. Okay. Anyways, we'll say so halacha l'maisa, right? Even if Vavilo Amar Tarnagol Zeh, I'm sorry, Rabbi Yehuda Ema said Bizman Amar Tarnagol Zeh Lavan. Avalim Amar Zeh V'Zeh Mutter. So halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says like this, that according to Rabbi Yehuda, if you just go ahead and you identify a white rooster, that's one thing. But if halacha l'maisa, you say Tarnagol Zeh Lavan, Avalim Amar Zeh V'Zeh Mutter. So halacha l'maisa again, if you go ahead and according to Rabbi Yehuda, and you're buying a group of roosters, even if the akum goes ahead and identifies that he wants a white rooster, ultimately, again, it is going to be permitted. Good. So we'll say there is an interesting exception to this rule. What's the exception to this rule? If halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says like this. If halacha l'maisa, the Ovid Kochavim says, if he's making a mishnah, he's making a party for his son, or he has someone who is ill inside of his home, ultimately it is going to be mutter. Now, what's the logic behind that? The logic behind that is if he's making a party, right, for his son, or ultimately, again, he has someone who's ill inside of his home, that means he's using the rooster for what? Consumption purposes, not for worship purposes. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, that will be mutter. The Gemara says, v'hatanya, oved kochavim sha'asa mishta libno, eino aser ela osa hayom va'osa ishbel. For 1 second, we just said before that in general, when an Oved Kochavim is making a celebration for his son, we'll say this is back to the beginning of the Masechta, right? That under circumstances like that, halacha l'maisa, it's always aser, right? In other words, we've seen that before. That those are times that, right, Oved Kochavim is making a celebration for his son. That's the time where dafka he would give thanks to his deity. So isn't that dafka an acute issue of Avoda Zara? To which the Gemara says, so again, see what's happening over here? So the Gemara says you can't go ahead and sell a white rooster to the akum. Why not? Why not? Because he's going to use it for Avoda Zara. Now the Gemara says, but if you know that he's making a simcha for his son, or you know that he's going ahead and has a chola inside of his house, you could sell him the white rooster. Why? Because it's clear that he's purchasing it for consumption purposes. I think Gemara said, but 1 second. We said before that on a day when he's making a celebration for his son, that's dafka a day when what? When he's going to go ahead and be worshiping his Avodah Zarah, giving thanks to his Avodah Zarah. So what's going on over here? Rabbi Yitzchak Barat Misharshia bitavzik. Bitavzik. What are we talking about over here? Tavzik. What's tavzik? Rashi says over here, tavzik glass Rashi and daf. Haim mishta diktani mucho limkar lo tarnagol lavan. The party, when we see that you're allowed to sell a white rooster, blav mishte chupas beno. To have vadel etakroves over this kocham kabay. You're right. If it's a wedding, you certainly can't sell him a white rooster because bepashtos, a person would go ahead and definitely give thanks to their avodah zara on a day where they're making a simcha for their son. So what's the party we're talking about over here? Ela b'mishta shel mereos she'osin hana'arim zeh im zeh v'lo chashiv kulei hai shikriv l'avodas chal. What are we talking about over here? Chav is getting together. Right. So Akum is hosting a get together for his friend. They're bringing a little bit. Right. So Lamaisa again, there's no life cycle event over here. Literally, again, it's just a group of guys getting together. What happens when a group of guys get together? Again, they're going to enjoy themselves, but there's no necessarily avodah zara component to this. That is going to be mutter to sell them a white rooster under those circumstances. Incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Tanan, Ushar called farm staman mutter perushan aser. Remember again, the Mishnah ended off by saying something very interesting. And everything else, right? All other items called the varim, staman mutter, if you just sell them stam to an akum is going to be mutter. Perushan aser, but if you explicit, in other words, it sounds like if it's explicitly sold for avodah zara, it's going to be aser. The Gemara says, my stam, my perushan. What does that mean exactly? What is stam? What's perushan? The Gemara says, ilema stama de kamar chiti chivarta, right? Chirushan de kamar la'avodas kochabim. So if you mean like this, maybe stam means David Chum says, I'm buying white wheat. I'm buying white wheat, right? And he doesn't say what it's for. It just says buying white wheat. And perush means he says, I'm buying white wheat for avodah zara, amud beis. The Gemara says, so lo stama tzricha l'meimar demisbinelei So I'll say that's an obvious case. That's an obvious case, right? That goes without saying. So obviously, if an Oved Kochavim comes along and the Oved Kochavim says, I'd like to buy white wheat, right? And he doesn't explicitly say what it's for, then why can't you go ahead and sell it to him? And if he says, I'm buying white wheat for Avoda Zara, of course you're not allowed to sell it to him. So what's going on over here? Ella, this is very interesting. Staman de ka'amar chiti, perushan de ka'amar chiyurta. Rather, Rabbi, what's happening over here is as follows. If an Akum comes along and says, I want to buy wheat, he doesn't say what kind of wheat, he doesn't say what it's for, he just says wheat, then ultimately, again, that is going to be mutter. That's the case of stam. The case of perush is where he says white wheat. White wheat, and that's going to be problematic because, again, explicitly asking for white wheat seems to indicate that he's using it for Avoda Zara. The Gemara says, Michlal, the Tarnagola afilu staman namilo. Now, we'll say, this is the case by wheat. Now, the Gemara is presupposing that a rooster is going to be even more chomer than a wheat case. And we could infer from here that whenever an akum asks to buy a rooster, it's most probably for Avoda Zara purposes, and even stam, right? Even if he doesn't explicitly say white one or for Avoda Zara, you still can't sell it to him. To which the Gemara says, Amri olam staman de ka'amar chiti k'amar chiti. I'm sorry, the Gemara said, sorry, the olam staman de ka'amar chiti chivarta. Perushan the ka'amar la'avodas kacham. So what's the Gemara says? No, it's not the case. Let's revisit the case. The case of stam is where an akum says, I'd like to purchase white wheat. That's the stam case. What's the perush case? The perush case is where he says, I'd like to purchase white wheat for Avoda Zara. Now, both say, now if an akum rolls into your store or comes to your house and says, I'd like to buy white wheat for Avoda Zara, right? So what's the pshat? It's obvious. Obviously, you can't go ahead and sell that to him. So what's the pshat? The Perush, the Gemara says, Uperushan is shichle. So this is fascinating. The Gemara says, no, I'll tell you why it's necessary. Saladait chamina, hi gavra, lav la'avodas kochavim kaboy. The boss said, listen to this havamina. I would have thought like this. Even when the akum comes over to me and he says he's looking to buy white wheat for Avoda Zara, he's not really buying it for Avoda Zara. It's not really for Avoda Zara. So why does he say Avoda Zara? Ella, mevik hu da'avik ba'avodas kochavim. Listen, the guy is an Avoda Zara guy, right? He is. He works Avoda Zara. The savar, kihechi dahu gavra avik bei, koli almanami aviku. So we'll say, so listen to this. So sometimes, so the Oved Avodah Zarah comes over to me, right? And he says, listen, he's a big Oved Avodah Zarah. Now he assumes that since he worships Avodah Zarah, therefore what? Everyone worships Avodah Zarah, right? That's what he's assuming. Therefore, he comes over to me, which I will say just is fascinating, right? How like we often assume that the way we think is the way other people think. What we do is what other people do. So this guy comes over to me. He like assumes I'm an Oved Avodah Zarah also, and therefore he says, "Hey Mahachi." Kihechi deles fuli. So I said, this is great. So when he says, I'd like to buy some white wheat for Avodah Zara, he doesn't mean it. Rather, what is he trying to do? What's happening over here? He's looking for a deal, right? He's looking for a deal. So like, come on. One Ovid Avodah Zara to another, right? Let's we trust it. By the way, can you imagine what a shtach, somebody coming over to think that you're Ovid Avodah Zara? Like, what must I be doing wrong in my life if someone thinks that I'm also an Ovid Avodah Zara? See, he doesn't mean it. What he's just trying to do is just trying to get a deal over here, right? And therefore, Allah Chalamaysa, I might have thought that he's not really using it for Avodah Zara. He's name dropping a little bit. A busy day at the Baal today, Baal Por, let's, right, it's gonna. So I might have thought that he's just going in and kind of dropping Avodah Zara just to get a discount. Kamash Malon, I will say, now, what does Kamash Malon mean over here? Kamash Malon could mean maybe he is doing that, maybe he's not doing that. I don't know what he's doing. But halacha l'maisa, if he says Avodah Zara, you can't get involved in such a transaction. That's the bottom line over here. Okay, so by Rav Ashi raised the kasha. Or right, Tarnikol Lavan Katsua, Lemi. So this is very interesting. What happens if the akum is in the marketplace and he's asking who has an amputated rooster? In other words, who has a rooster missing a finger, claw, digit, right? Who has a rooster missing something? So Mal Limkarlo, Tarnagol Lavan Shalim. So we'll say, so let's say I don't have an amputated rooster, but what I do have is a perfectly whole and healthy white rooster, right? Am I allowed to sell him the white rooster? Now, what's the shaila? So on one hand, the fact that he's looking for an amputated rooster would clearly indicate that what? This is not for Avoda Zara, right? Because for Avoda Zara, they don't use this kind of rooster. So maybe I can sell him the white rooster as well. Oh, Dilma Irume Kama Arim. Or maybe this is he's playing a trick. This is a ruse, right? Why? Because he's a smart guy. He knows that the Jews are not going to sell him white roosters. So what does he do? He pretends like he doesn't care what kind of rooster it is, knowing full well that the vendors probably have white roosters, and therefore be able to get a white rooster. Incredible. So the Gemara says, "Vimtin salomar hayrumik could come arim." Now, if you want to say that the whole thing is a ruse and he's really just trying to get a white rooster, the Gemara says, "Tarnago lavan lemi." Tarnago lavan lemi v'yavule shachar v'shakol v'yavule adam v'shakol ma'ulim karlo lavan. So what about the following case? Let's say where the Akum comes along, the Akum says, I'm looking to buy a white rooster. And what happens? I say, I don't have a white rooster, but I'll sell you a black rooster. And he buys it. Or a red rooster, and he buys it. Can I then sell him a white rooster? Why? So the Gemara says, so on one hand, since he bought the white rooster and the black rooster, then obviously he's not using his roosters for idolatrous service, and therefore selling him the white one is not a problem. Oh, Dilma, Irume Kama Arin. Or maybe not. Maybe the whole thing is a ruse. In other words, the Akum is a smart guy also. He knows he needs to get the white rooster. He's not going to get the white rooster straight out. So maybe he's just pretending like he doesn't care, ultimately in order to get the white rooster. To which the Gemara says, Teku. Okay. So what leaves us as an open-ended question. Weiter. Rabbi Meir Omer Af Dekel. So Rabbi Meir said, even what he called Dekel Tov. What is this? Gemara says, Amrle Rav Chisda Adimi. Gemiri, Rabbi is incredible. Gemiri, da avodas kol chavim da Avram Avinu, dalit mea pirke havyon. So we have Mesora, that Avram Avinu also had Mesachas Avoda Zara. He also had Mesachas Avoda Zara, because Rabbi say again, Avram Avinu also had to know how to navigate the Avoda Zara realities of his time. But this, Avram Avinu's Mesachas Avoda Zara was 400 prakim. 400 prakim. The Gemara says, "Va'anon chamisha tanan v'lo yadinan," whereas our Mesachas Avoda Zara is only 5 chapters, and yet we struggle with it. So as I said, obviously, interestingly enough, the fact that Avram Avinu's Mesachas Avoda Zara was 400 chapters indicates to us that Avram Avinu, first of all, for Avram Avinu, this was halacha l'maisa, right? Profound halacha l'maisa, day in and day out. He had to know how to navigate the theological complexities of the spiritual landscape of his time. So 400 prakim, and ours is only 5. So we'll say, so interestingly enough, I'll just point out how beautiful is this. Like the Gemara says, Avram Avinu had Mesachas Avoda Zara, and we have Mesachas Avoda Zara. One of the most beautiful things I will say, when you open up a Blat Gemara like here, we're on Avoda Zara Daf Yud Dalet. So just to understand that our fathers, our grandfathers, our great-grandfathers, everyone saw the same page with the same words. There's something so beautiful to knowing this, and there's the power of Torah in general. Torah links you to the entire historical continuity and the future continuity of Klal Yisrael. My children look at the same Blat Gemara, and my grandchildren will see the same Blat Gemara, and my great-grandchildren will see the same Blat Gemara. It's the most incredible and beautiful and overwhelming thing in the world. The nitzchias. There are so many things in life that will change. But Mesechus Avodah Zara, Daf Yudalid, it was the same for generations before me, and it'll be the same for generations after me. So often in life, there are so many things that we put our efforts into or we spend our time with, and they may endure or they may not endure. One thing is clear. When I put an investment in Torah, that is an investment that will last, but it has lasted up until this day, and it will absolutely unequivocally last until the end of time, right? How incredible is it to think you pick up your Gemara, you hold your Avodah Zara, Avram Avinu also had Avoda Zara. Now, granted, his Avoda Zara, I don't know how many chalokim that is an art scroll, right? 400 chapters. 400 chapters, it's like a shelf, right? Right? But Lamaisa will say, how just incredible is it to think about that? Avram Avinu held his Maseches Avoda Zara, and you and I, as we go through our day, hold our own Maseches Avoda Zara. The continuity of Torah, to be rooted in something that is nitzchi. So many things in our life that we spend our time on are fleeting, in reality are generally unimportant. But the Torah we have is absolutely eternal. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Umay Kasha, what's the issue? The Tanya Rabbi Meir Omer, Af Dekel Tav, the Chatzav V'Niklas, Asher L'Grola Obed Kochavim. So the Gemara says over here that, remember, the Mishnah said all of these items, you're not allowed to sell to Obed Kochavim. The Gemara says, so Dekel Tofu Dulomas Binan, Hot Dekel Bishmizab Ninan. So understand, you can't sell a good palm tree to an akum, but you could sell a bad palm tree. Like, just trying to figure out what does it even mean? Vatnan, what we learned was that in general, you can't sell an akum anything that is attached to the ground. I was saying, I will get to this in just a couple of days, that you're not allowed to sell an akum land. Can't sell them land. Right now, again, we're going to discuss, is this clearly it's Eretz Yisrael. Is it Chutz La'aretz as well? We'll talk about this. But again, so what says, how am I able to sell him a palm tree at all? Right? Because at the end of the day, a palm tree is attached to the earth. So I'm going to sell palm tree at all. Good palm tree, bad palm tree. So the Gemara says, Amrle, my dekel tov. So what is dekel tov? Peros dekel tov. It ultimately again refers to the fruit of a palm tree. V'chein Amar Avuna, Peros Dekel Tov. Okay, so it says now we're going to go through the rest of the list. So you can't sell it again. These were all items that were used for Avodah Zarah purposes. Chatzav, what's a chatzav? Kashba. Okay, a chatzav is a kashba. Rashi says over here, mint morim. It's a type of date. Niklas, what's a niklas? Kiyas Rabdimi Amram Chama Bar Yosef Kuraiti. Kuraiti, okay. Rashi says over here, min peros, another type of fruit. Omri Abayla Rabdimi Tnan Niklas Veloya Dinan Mahu. So again, so Rabdimi said we learned Niklas. We don't know what Niklas is. Va'at Amrit Kuraiti. You see, it's this type of fruit. Veloya Dinan Maya Hanaslan. So Amrle. So I'll say. So again, here's the issue. It's not like Kuraiti helps us all that much more than what Niklas is. Okay, so what's Niklas? It's Karaiti. What's Karaiti? It's Niklas. What do they both mean? I have no idea. Right. But Lamai says, so how exactly do these alternative definitions help me? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Maya Hanaslan, Amalei Ahani Lahu, Tichi Azlis Hasam, Amrat Lahu Niklas, Falo Yadi, Amrat Lahu Karaiti, Biyadi the Kamach. Ultimately, I will say, I'll tell you why it does help. It helps at the end of the day because if you go to Eretz Yisrael and you say Niklas, you might not know what it is, but they'll tell you Karaiti, and ultimately I'm going to be able to point out to you what it is. So apparently, again, Niklas was the more uncommon name. Karaiti was the more common name. So although for us it might not be so helpful when you go to Eretz Yisrael, and again you go ahead and you say Karaiti, they'll be able to point you in the direction of what it is that they are discussing. We'll stop over today. Tremendous stuff. Shkoyach, everyone. We'll say, yes. Also, Minyan 6:50 this morning. Last Minyan at the Kaplan Shiva home. That is 6:50 a.m. 3112 Hatton Road. Whoever could help make me much appreciated. Shkoyach, everyone. Should be simchas. On Zoom, I'm sorry that I'm frozen. I think you still hear me because you're all still here. So I guess that means you hear my voice, right? So I'm sorry that somehow I froze, and the tech team is not on site today. Let's have a great day, everyone.
All right.
Interesting.
And that's really fine. Very true.
Right, behind.
That's it.